In this lesson, you're going to learn how to calculate the implied share price for Apple based on the DCF analysis here, and then how we use this information to create what are known as sensitivity tables that let us look at Apple's value at a range of different terminal EBITDA multiples, terminal growth rates, and different discount rates. So to start with, the first thing we want to do here is get to Apple's price per share that's implied by this enterprise value of $224 billion. The reason why we need to do this, the reason why this is important is because Apple is a public company, and for public companies, we almost always look at valuation on a share price basis. If Apple were private, if this were a private company, we might just stick with enterprise value or equity value, but for public companies, shareholders and investors are always focused on the share price, so that's why we need to get to that here. So to do this, we need to work backwards to go from enterprise value to equity value. So for enterprise value, I'm just going to link to the number above. Now, if you remember how we go from equity value to enterprise value, we subtract cash and then add debt, add preferred stock, add minority interest, and so on. To do the opposite, to go from enterprise value to equity value, then we do the exact opposite. So we're going to add cash and then subtract debt, preferred stock, minority interest. So for this balance sheet adjustment, I'm going to go over to the three-statement model once again. So I'm going to add cash and then subtract debt, minority interest, preferred stock, and then other liabilities. Just to add these up, we see that our implied equity value is much higher in this case than our enterprise value. Not surprising given that Apple has a huge cash balance and not much else on its balance sheet in terms of debt or other liabilities. Now that we have the equity value, we can get to the implied price per share. What I'm going to do for this is take our equity value, multiply by units, because remember our equity value is in millions, but our shares are only in thousands. So I'm going to divide by diluted shares outstanding right here. And that gets us to our implied price per share for Apple, which as you see is almost $100 higher in this case than what their current share price is. Their current share price is $192. Their implied price per share according to the DCF is $281. Now this calculation is not 100% precise. The reason is because if you think about it, this is really a circular calculation. To figure out what Apple's implied price per share is, we need to look at their option dilution. And we know that if their share price is higher, then they're going to get more dilution here, which changes the share count. So if we wanted to be more accurate here, we would change this into a circular calculation. And you do actually do that at banks. We're not going to bother with it because it doesn't make that much of a difference in this case, and because we're really focused on the concepts and what you need for interviews here. So now that we have this, we're going to go in and calculate our sensitivity tables. And I mentioned before that whenever we're looking at a DCF analysis, it's really important to look at a range of different outputs, a range of different valuations here. Because if we just assume that the EBITDA multiple is always 7x, or that the terminal growth rate is always 3%, or that the discount rate is always 10%, that's problematic. Because the truth is we have no way of really predicting what's going to happen 5 years into the future. We need to establish a wide range of sensitivities here that let us see the best case and worst case scenarios. So I'm going to start with the first table here, which is going to show us the terminal growth rate versus the discount rate. So this shows us the impact of the discount rate versus the terminal growth rate on our analysis. For the discount rate, recall that our baseline assumption up here is 10%. So I'm actually going to start with this 10% right here. And what I'm going to do is range this up by 1% each year. So I'm going to add 1% to this number each year, so that by the end here, we see that we're ranging this from 10% all the way up to 16%. I just have bolded the one in the middle as well. So this is a decent range for the different discount rates we might be assuming here. Now for the terminal growth rate, remember that our assumption here is 3%. So I'm actually going to start with 0% right here, and then I'm going to increase this by 1% in each row. So we're going from 0% assumed growth, which is probably far too low, It's probably not going to be 0%. It's probably going to be at least 1, 2, 3%. But we are starting in the worst case scenario here, and we are going all the way up to 5% for the terminal growth rate. Now the next step here is we want to link the top left cell of this table. So cell C31 here, the top left cell, we want to link this to the implied share price. We have that. And now what we want to do is actually calculate the sensitivity and look at the implied share price based on different discount rates and different terminal growth rates here. So to do this, I'm going to highlight the whole table with Shift Control down arrow key and then right arrow key. Now I'll press Alt DT. This brings up the data table input. And for the row input cell, I'm going to select the discount rate up here. For the column input cell, I'm going to select the terminal growth rate right here. Hit OK. And I just saved this file to refresh the data table, and now we see that we have a range of different values here, and we have the company's implied share price at different discount rates and different terminal growth rates. Now the actual mechanics of the table, literally what it's doing is it's going through our calculation that we used here to get to the implied share price, and it's making this calculation for every single combination in this table. So for 0% terminal growth rate and 10% discount rate, 11%, 12%, and so on, it's going in and actually making the calculation right here, is how a sensitivity table like this works. Now one thing we want to also do here is check our math and make sure that intuitively it's going in the right direction. We expect that as the discount rate increases, our value should decrease because we're discounting it more, and that is indeed what happens here. We also expect that as the terminal growth rate increases, our value should increase because the company is going to be growing more into the future, and that's exactly what happens here. We also see that the best case scenario here is around 358 per share. The worst case is around 155 per share. So interestingly, if our analysis here is correct, then that means that Apple's current value of 192 per share may actually be undervaluing the company because it places it somewhere in this quadrant over here. So for your exercise now, what I want you to do is to actually create your own data table down here, similar to what I did above for the terminal growth rate, except I want you to use terminal EBITDA multiple instead. So still use discount rate over here, but I want you to use terminal EBITDA multiple for this variable instead. What you should also do is change this back to using the multiples method right here so that the table works properly. So go in right now and do everything I did except use terminal EBITDA multiple instead. And for the range here, since we're assuming 7x for the terminal EBITDA multiple, you can start at 4x and then increment it by 1 each year. So go in and do that. Use Alt DT to bring up the data table and to fill that in. But give that a shot yourself right now and see if you can replicate the steps that I did right here to create this data table. So pause this video right now, try that. Then when you're done, you can unpause this and then we'll go through it together. Okay, good. So here's how we go in and create this table. As I said before, we're going to start with 4x for the terminal EBITDA multiple. And to increment this by 1 each year, I'm just going to take this and add 1 and copy this formula down. For the discount rate, we can actually link directly to the ones right above here. And now I'll copy this one across. For the upper left cell, remember that we want to link to the implied price per share right here. Then we want to highlight the whole table with Shift Control down and then right, Alt DT for the data table. For the row input cell, we want to be using the discount rate. And then for the column input cell, we want to be using the terminal EBITDA multiple right here. So I'll hit save to refresh this. We see that the first table now has all the same numbers throughout because we're no longer using the terminal growth rate. We're now using the multiples method instead. And now we see that our table here is giving us the appropriate values. Interestingly enough, with the terminal multiples method here, It looks like Apple's current value of 192 per share is closer to the middle of the range here. So just interesting to note that depending on the methodology we use for the terminal value, Apple's current share price either looks undervalued or about appropriate at its current level. So you should now have an understanding of how to create sensitivity tables like this for DCF analysis and how to get to a company's implied price per share when using a DCF analysis like this. Again, the purpose of the sensitivity table, the reason why we need it is because we don't want to just look at one value for the multiple or for the long-term growth rate or for the discount rate. We want to look at it over a range of values to simulate what could actually happen many years into the future. There's always going to be a margin of error. We don't know what exactly it's going to be, but the sensitivity table lets us take into account this margin of error and show it in our analysis. At a bank, you might look at a number of different variables here. You could look at revenue growth percentage. You could look at profitability margins, EBITDA margins here. So you could also use these for sensitivity tables. We're not going to bother because we're pulling in this data directly from our three-statement model, but those are other variables that you might look at in sensitivity tables like this. So that's it for our DCF analysis. Coming up in the next two videos, we're going to be looking at some common interview questions you might get on the topic of a DCF. And then after that, we'll be getting into the discount rate, and I'll be showing you how to calculate the discount rate in more detail and all of the math that goes into that, and figuring out more accurately what kind of discount rate we should use for Apple.